Tonight, we drift back in time, not to marvel at crowns or kingdoms, but to explore the quiet burdens worn beneath them. Burdens stitched in silk, powdered in lead, hidden behind tapestries and thick perfumes. So lie back, let the candlelight in your mind flicker low, and allow the world to grow soft, as we step gently into the private chambers of royal women, where elegance was expected, but comfort rarely entered. You see, royalty was never just power, it was performance. And for women born into courts and castles, that performance began with the body itself. Long before soap and science, cleanliness was not a daily ritual, it was a seasonal indulgence. A luxury sometimes feared, sometimes misunderstood, and often replaced with layers of illusion. Imagine a French queen in the 17th century, her skin glowing beneath white powder made from crushed lead. She smiles at court, lips tinted with a vermilion paste laced with mercury. Her hair is piled high, dusted in flour and swarming, though no one dares say it aloud. To bathe too often was believed to be dangerous. Water, especially warm water, was thought to open the pores and allow disease to slip inside. Better, they thought, to cover the smell than risk letting the sickness in. And so, instead of washing, they masked. Oils and animal fats were rubbed into the scalp. Garments were steeped in lavender and clove. Gloves were perfumed. Handkerchiefs soaked in rosewater were held beneath the nose, a barrier between the wearer and the world's rot. But the rot was not always outside. In the still silence of royal bedchambers, lice danced in powdered wigs. Teeth blackened beneath sugared smiles. Corsets bound the ribs, bruised the skin, and pressed organs into unnatural shapes. Beauty hurt. But more than that, it decayed. Behind every painting of grace was a woman itching beneath brocade, bleeding from tight shoes, breathing through silk soaked in musk, masking the unwashed air of courtly life. This was not negligence, it was belief. A belief shaped by centuries of fear, ritual, and misunderstanding. And still, they endured. They powdered, they paraded, they posed beneath chandeliers and danced through rooms heavy with incense and expectation. Their lives were not their own. They belonged to spectacle, and nowhere was that more apparent than in the rituals of hygiene. In the hushed corridors of Versailles, beneath gold-leafed ceilings and hand-painted skies, women moved like artwork come to life. But their stillness, their composure, came at a cost few spoke of. Beneath the silks and velvets, their bodies were trapped. Layers upon layers, sewn with fine thread and duty, left little room for breath or for truth. A royal woman could not simply undress and bathe. It was a process, scheduled, supervised, ceremonial. In many courts, she would be bathed by attendants, scrubbed not with soap but with linen cloths soaked in wine or vinegar, followed by dustings of powdered herbs. But even these sparse rituals were rare. The belief still lingered that water could weaken the body, open unseen doors for plague or spirits to slip through. So they bathed in perfume, and when the scent faded, they reapplied. And when that too turned sour, they pressed another layer of powder atop their skin. In time, the mixture of sweat, oils, and crushed botanicals hardened into a second skin, a shell of expectation, cracking only in private when the mirrors were turned away. To cleanse the hands, lemon water. To freshen the mouth, cloves and burnt bread ash. To perfume the air, pots of lavender boiled near the hearth. To hide the scent of unwashed undergarments, they were smoked over embers. And yet the scent of sickness always lingered. Sweet and sour, faint but cloying, like memory. Hair rarely washed became nests, not just for style, but for lice. Wigs were removed and placed near the fire, so the heat could drive out the crawling things that lived within. Even queens scratched when no one watched. Even duchesses winced as corset bones bruised their ribs. Even empresses bled quietly into chemises that no one would ever see. There is a cruelty in beauty when it is demanded. And for these women, beauty was not a gift. It was a duty performed daily at the expense of breath, blood, and skin. In portraits, they are flawless still, eternal. But history does not paint the itch beneath the wig. It does not capture the scent of rot beneath roses. It does not speak of the quiet toll taken by rituals meant to please everyone, but the wearer. And so we remember them now, not with judgment, but with gentleness. They too were bound by their time, by what was known, by what was feared, and still they endured. There is a mirror that hangs in memory, tall, gilded, quiet, and in it the women of court watched themselves become illusions. Pale skin was prized, not just admired, but demanded. And so they dusted their faces with white powders, a ghostly shimmer made from lead and vinegar, known as ceruse. It smoothed the complexion, it masked blemishes, it gave the illusion of untouched youth, but it also poisoned the blood. With every application, a little more of the body turned against itself. Teeth loosened, hair thinned, muscles weakened, and still the powder was applied. To hide the damage, more powder. To colour the cheeks, crushed cochineal insects suspended in spirits or wax. To redden the lips, cinnabar, mercury, or the blood of small animals mixed with crushed rubies. To define the eyes, lamp-black soot collected from candle flames and pressed into paste. These were not rituals of vanity, they were performances of survival. To appear sickly was to risk being replaced. To age was to lose influence. To be anything other than luminous was to disappear, slowly, politely, beneath the gold-tipped fingers of the court. And so, even as skin blistered, as gums bled, as lashes fell, the painting continued. Some whispered that the queen's skin peeled in the night, that beneath her collar red welts bloomed like fever, that her handmaidens wept quietly as they wiped away the powder, only to reapply it by morning light. But no one spoke of it openly. Silence, too, was part of the performance. Behind every royal's glow was the flicker of a candle burning just a little too close to the skin. And yet, they smiled, they posed, they married for power, they bowed to kings, bore heirs, played roles. And each morning they returned to the mirror, not to see themselves, but to erase themselves again. There is a certain loneliness in being watched but never truly seen. And perhaps, beneath all the powder, beneath all the perfume, that is what ached the most. In the soft hush of a royal chamber, where light filtered through lace curtains and footsteps echoed on marble floors, cleanliness was not what we know it to be. To be clean, in those times, did not mean to be free of dirt. It meant to be presentable, unoffensive to the senses of others. And so the body became a quiet battlefield. To wash, one did not step into a tub. Baths were rare, feared, and reserved for ceremony or sickness. Instead, a lady might wipe her arms with vinegar-damp cloths, dab her neck with rosewater, and brush her undergarments with lavender buds stored in embroidered sachets. These garments, pressed close to the skin, were rarely laundered. They absorbed the day's sweat, the body's quiet exhalations, and were worn again, steeped in tradition and perfume. At night, her linens might be hung before a fire, not to be washed, but to be smoked. The smoke was thought to purify, to kill the invisible, to lull the senses into believing all was well. And for the most private parts of the body, there were herbs. Dried petals tucked discreetly into folds of fabric, ointments scented with ambergris or myrrh, meant to soothe, but also to disguise. Because in the eyes of the court, a royal woman's body was not hers. It was a symbol, a tool, a vessel for beauty, lineage, and diplomacy. And symbols are not allowed to sweat, so they powdered what could not be washed, they masked what could not be named. And when discomfort came, itch, rash, inflammation, it was suffered in silence. Doctors were men, and women, even queens, feared being dismissed, diminished, or mocked for speaking of their private pain. And so pain became ritual, another layer worn beneath the corset, another silence to carry through the long hours of posing, performing, smiling. But even silence leaves a scent, and even rituals leave residue, and the weight of all this, of being seen but not touched, touched but not healed, pressed itself into the very bones of the women history forgot. They were not just royalty, they were endurance wrapped in satin. And when they finally slept, their dreams perhaps were of rivers, of open air, of soap and solitude, of being simply themselves. There were no words for it, not truly, no public names for the monthly rhythm that shaped so much of a royal woman's life. Menstruation was not mentioned at court. It was veiled, avoided, and pressed into silence. Just another discomfort folded beneath velvet and lace. But it came nonetheless. Like the moon pulling the tides, it arrived on schedule or not at all, marking time in a world that wanted everything hidden. When it did, there were no pads or clean linens waiting. Instead, women used cloth, soft scraps of linen folded and pinned, worn under layers of garments, often soaked and reused again and again. There were no private bathrooms, no plumbing, no easy way to clean, especially during long ceremonies or carriage journeys. And when cramps came, they were not soothed with heat or rest, but endured with a clenched jaw beneath a painted face. Because even in pain, They had to smile. Even in discomfort, they had to represent something more than human. And when the bleeding stopped, when the womb fell silent again, the expectations returned louder than before. Children were not just hoped for, they were demanded. And so intimacy was not pleasure, it was duty, often arranged, often cold, often painful. A woman might be barely more than a child herself, married off for politics, pressed into gowns she did not choose, taught to stand beside a man she barely knew, and told that her worth was measured in heirs. When the act was done, she might lie awake, her body sore from pressure and expectation, her mind drifting far beyond the walls of her chamber. And yet she would rise. Each morning she would be powdered, her hair would be dressed, her face arranged into something quiet, pleasant, proper, and no one would ask how she felt, because feeling too was not permitted. But in the stolen moments, in gardens, in baths, in rare pockets of solitude, perhaps she breathed. Perhaps she remembered the sound of her own thoughts. Perhaps she wished to be seen not as a queen or a duchess or an ornament, but as a person. One with a body, a cycle, a heart. Not painted, not powdered, but whole. Even in death, a royal woman's body did not belong to her. When the final breath left her lips and the palace fell into a hush, she was not allowed to simply rest. Instead, the rituals began. Her body would be washed, perhaps for the first time in weeks, by trembling hands beneath candlelight. Oils were poured over her skin, rose, clove, myrrh, not to honor her life, but to mask the truth of her leaving. Her hair, once stiff with powder, was brushed until it softened, then arranged in curls or braids to resemble the youthful version of herself the court preferred to remember. Linen shrouds were scented, not just for mourning, but for illusion. Because even in stillness, the royal body was a message, a symbol of grace, of order, of beauty, and to suggest it had ever suffered, that it had ever rotted, ever bled, ever ached beneath the crown, was too much for those who had only seen her in portraits. So the truth was buried beneath silks, and the silence continued. But what remains in the folds of old letters, in the cracked paint of forgotten miniatures, in the whispered legends told by handmaidens long gone, is something deeper, a quiet knowing, that she endured, that she smiled through fevers, that she stood through pain, that she bled and bowed and burned beneath her bodice and still rose to greet the day. Not because she was royalty, but because she was human. And that truth, hidden for centuries beneath perfume and powdered wigs, is perhaps the most sacred of all. Now the castle halls are quiet. The candles flicker low, the powder jars sit untouched. The gowns are folded away in cedar chests, their silks no longer rustling through cold corridors. And in the hush of history, what remains is not the spectacle, not the lace or the jewels or the powdered smiles, but the women themselves, their ache, their endurance, their resilience whispered between the folds of ritual. They were not weak for obeying, they were not vain for painting their faces. They were surviving, in the only way they were allowed to. They moved through worlds built by men, shaped by superstition, governed by silence, and still they found ways to leave behind echoes. Not in history books, not in statues or stone, but in the softness of remembered gestures, the letters tucked in drawers, the fabric scraps stained by life itself. It is easy to forget that royalty bled, that queens bruised, that empresses flinched when corsets were pulled too tight. But it is in remembering those truths, in peeling back the veils of perfume and ceremony, that we find something real, something human, something close. And as you rest now, as your breath softens and your mind begins to drift, perhaps you carry a piece of their story with you, not to judge it, not to change it, but simply to know it was real, to know that beneath the crown, beneath the powder, beneath the centuries of silence, they lived. And so gently now, let the candle burn low, let the past fold itself away like a silk nightgown, and let your own body, warm and tired, sink into the quiet peace they were never given in life. Sleep well and dream softly for them. There were places in palaces that no map ever marked, rooms behind rooms, chambers behind curtains, corners where only women walked, quietly, deliberately, unseen. These were not halls for hosting guests, nor courts for holding judgment. They were private places, spaces for bleeding, for hiding pain, for removing the mask that royalty demanded at dawn. The Queen's withdrawing room, The handmaidens' quarters, the small, cold spaces where servants combed out wigs infested with life and coated with powder. Here in low light, royal women unfastened their burdens. Their gowns were unlaced, revealing the bruises corsets left behind. Their shoes were pulled from swollen feet, and their skin, blotched, blistered, bitten, was finally allowed to breathe. These were the only spaces where vulnerability was not a scandal, where pain was not corrected with perfume, where they could finally say, "I'm tired. I'm sore. I can't do this again tomorrow." Sometimes a girl of 14 would sit trembling as her hair was curled for marriage. Sometimes a mother would cradle her stillborn child in silence while the court outside celebrated her fertility. And sometimes, just sometimes, a queen would laugh. Not the practiced, delicate sound expected at feasts, but something cracked and real, the kind of laughter that makes the women around her look up in astonishment. Because to laugh, to cry, to ache was to be human. And in these hidden rooms, beneath plastered ceilings and between heavy drapes, the human slipped out, carefully, tenderly, like light through a keyhole. And in that sliver of truth, something sacred remained. What could not be spoken in court was whispered in linen rooms, behind folding screens, beneath the rustle of skirts and the hush of hot coals in shallow braziers. Royal women were not taught their bodies through scrolls or science. They learned from hands. A mother adjusting a daughter's bodice, a nursemaid changing cloth wrappings after childbirth, an old midwife showing how to make a poultice for a rash no doctor would acknowledge. The knowledge of the body, its pulses, its aches, its bleeding, was passed not with ceremony, but with gesture. A hand brushing the wrist to feel for fever. A shared glance when the blood came late. A soft cloth tucked into a pocket for the moment no one would prepare her for. There were herbs they kept hidden in pouches or pressed into drawers. Mugwort for cramping, chamomile for calming, juniper for cleansing. These things were not discussed aloud. Not in ballrooms, not in drawing rooms, not in the presence of men who believed discomfort was unbecoming of grace. But among women, behind closed doors, they built a quiet, invisible map of survival. They knew how to care for boils under the collar. They knew what perfume to use when the undergarments hadn't been washed in weeks. They knew how to stand just so to keep from fainting as their corsets dug deeper into their sides. They knew. And that knowing, passed down, repeated, folded into routine, was often the only defense they had against a world that saw their bodies as vessels, as ornaments, as symbols, but not as sacred. Still, they kept the rituals alive. Not out of vanity, but out of quiet defiance. To say, "I see you, I understand this ache, you are not alone." And in that silent understanding, they stitched a kind of sisterhood beneath the brocade. Beyond the palace walls, the world watched. Every powdered cheek, every bejeweled comb, every whisper of royal ritual was mirrored by those who wished to belong, or at least not to fall behind. The noblewoman in her stone manor copied the queen's hair arrangements, though lice spread faster without maids to comb them out. The merchant's wife rubbed ceruse on her cheeks, not knowing the headaches, the skin peeling, the slow poison she'd invited beneath her skin. Peasant girls learned to perfume their gloves with crushed petals and vinegar, while their mothers boiled their only linens in soot water to stretch them one more month. Royal fashion didn't stay in the castle. It bled downward, dripping slowly into the lives of everyone who watched, sometimes with wonder, sometimes with envy, often with pain. Because when the queen did not bathe, bathing fell out of favour. When the duchess powdered instead of cleansing, young girls imitated. When blood was hidden in silence, women everywhere learned to suffer with a smile. It was not malicious. It was not designed to harm. But the pedestal is a strange kind of prison, not only for those standing on it, but for those watching from below. The idea of beauty became performance, and performance became sacrifice. And so from court to cottage, women learned to reshape themselves in the image of a myth. Not a person, not a body, a silhouette framed in gold. One that didn't sweat, didn't ache, didn't age. And they paid for that myth with their comfort, their health, their quiet. And still, in quiet corners of the world, they made their own rituals. Boiled mint leaves for sore gums, soft wool wraps for aching bellies, gentle lullabies hummed while brushing lice from a sister's hair. In the absence of freedom, they found gentleness. And in that gentleness, Perhaps something stronger than all the silk in the kingdom. The gowns are dust now. The powders have faded. The perfumes, once cloying and sacred, have long since disappeared into air. But still, if you walk slowly through the corridors of memory, you can feel them. Not the queens on the thrones, not the names written in ink and marble, but the women who prepared their skin with trembling hands. The girls who stood too long in tight shoes. The mothers who gave birth behind velvet drapes, alone but watched. History has always been louder for those who never had to whisper. But it is in the whispers that truth survives, in the echo of cloth being folded after midnight, in the hush of breath drawn through aching ribs, in the soft scraping of a comb through knotted hair, done not for beauty, but for peace. So let the silence honor them now. Let us remember that beauty, once demanded, can now be reclaimed as choice. That discomfort, once endured, can now be named. That the body, once masked, can now be seen for what it is, sacred, flawed, whole. And as you rest, let your body soften where theirs could not. Let your muscles fall loose, your breath deepen, your thoughts quiet. You are not in a corset. You are not bound by perfume or pearls. You are safe. You are real. You are here. Sleep now, gently. For them, for yourself, for the forgotten softness beneath all that silk. Childbirth was a storm behind closed doors, and for royal women, it was not followed by peace. There were no soft hospital beds, no quiet days to recover. Instead, there were duties. There were appearances. There were eyes, always eyes, waiting to judge the body that had just delivered an heir. The moment a royal infant took its first breath, the mother became secondary. Attendants wrapped the newborn in silks, whisked it away to be presented, weighed, celebrated. And the woman who had just endured hours, sometimes days of labor, was left trembling in perfumed sheets, bruised, torn, and forgotten. The lying-in period followed, a prescribed confinement of 40 days, not for her health, but to purify her, to make her presentable again. She was not permitted to attend Mass. She was not allowed to walk freely. She was expected to remain in her chamber, curtains drawn, visits minimal. But the silence was not restful. It was heavy. It pressed into the walls, echoed in her bones. The bleeding continued. The milk came or didn't. The stitches pulled. The body, now changed, unfamiliar, ached in new places. And still she was expected to emerge from that chamber radiant. They powdered her again, pressed corsets against a tender belly, painted colour back into cheeks that had drained white with pain. No one asked how she felt, only how soon she might bear the next. And yet, in the dim quiet of those 40 days, something sacred lingered. A handmaiden warming cloths with lavender, a midwife humming a lullaby to soothe swelling, a moment alone, where the queen, just for a breath, felt like a mother instead of a monument. Even in a world that didn't allow her to rest, rest tried to find her. Sickness does not bow. It does not knock before entering a palace. It does not care for bloodlines or the titles that precede a name. And when it came for a royal woman, it came quietly. First as a tremble in the fingers, a heaviness behind the eyes, a cough that lingered too long after the fire had dimmed. But admitting illness was dangerous. To be sick was to appear weak, and to appear weak was to risk being forgotten, or worse, replaced. So she smiled, even as her joints stiffened. Even as fever took hold, even as her handmaidens exchanged worried glances over morning tea she could not keep down. Physicians were summoned, not to heal but to reassure. They brought herbs packed in velvet, tinctures of wine, mercury, powders too bitter to swallow without honey, and always leeches, always bleeding. Let the bad humours out, they said, even as strength drained faster than fever. She was propped up on pillows stuffed with swan feathers, her nightgown freshly scented, her hair arranged in soft curls for the visiting court. Because even in illness, she was not permitted to be undone. And yet, her body could not be silenced forever. There were nights she bit down on silk napkins to keep from moaning. Mornings she awoke unsure if she had slept at all. They wrote letters declaring her in good spirits. They painted her with eyes that glowed. But her reflection told another story. In the mirror, she saw the pallor no powder could fix. The ribs too visible, the once gloved hands trembling in her lap. But perhaps the worst pain was not of the body, but of invisibility. To be seen only when radiant. To be erased the moment she dimmed. And yet in the silence of her chamber, as wind rattled the stained glass, she held on. Not as a queen, but as a woman refusing to vanish. She was 5 when they pierced her ears, 7 when she learned to sit without fidgeting, 9 when she was told to smile when spoken to, but never too broadly. By 10, she knew the scent of lavender oil, the sting of cold water on her scalp, and the weight of a jeweled circlet that left faint indentations on her forehead. She was a royal girl, a future duchess, perhaps a queen, and her childhood was not her own. Each morning began with instruction, not in arithmetic or dreams, but in posture, etiquette, restraint. She was taught how to walk, how to hold her hands, how to lower her eyes at just the right angle to seem demure but not dull. They laced her gowns with care, binding her not for modesty, but for practice, because one day her body would be bound by expectation. And when the blood first came, there was no celebration, only hushed words, a cloth, a reminder, you are a woman now, you must be careful. Careful not to show pain, not to ask too many questions, not to forget that her life was a mirror meant to reflect someone else's pride. And yet, in quiet moments, she found slivers of herself. In the garden, where dirt clung to her shoes, and she laughed untrained. In the bath, when steam curled her hair, and she could almost forget that she was being prepared like a precious object. Sometimes her nursemaid would hum, a song from her own village, a tune that spoke of rivers and wind, not powder and pearls. And the girl would close her eyes, not to sleep, but to remember how it felt to simply be. Not a princess, not a future bride, just a child in a world of silk that was never soft where it mattered. In the oldest part of the palace, beneath beams blackened by centuries of candle smoke, there is a room with no records, no tapestries, no portraits, just dust and air that smells of lavender and ash. This room once belonged to her. Not a queen whose name history recorded, but a woman whose story was woven into the fabric of every dress worn after her. A thread passed down not through bloodlines, but through knowing. She had walked barefoot here, long after the courtiers had gone. Let her hair down with trembling hands, unbound it from the expectations stitched into every braid. She had whispered things to herself in this room that she dared not speak elsewhere, and when she was gone, the room remained, empty, but never hollow, still echoing with the weight of a body that had lived entirely in service to beauty, to nation, to myth. Centuries later, another girl would find herself standing in the same room, not knowing why her breath caught there, why the air felt heavier, why she suddenly remembered the sting of a corset she had never worn. Because the memory of suffering is not always carried in the mind. Sometimes it lives in the bones. And royal women, they carried 1,000 such memories. Generations of pain left unspoken, not out of shame, but because there was never time, never room, never safety. Aches in the back from hours of standing still. Bruises hidden under pearl sleeves, the stretch of skin after childbirth, never fully shrinking back. The quiet terror of growing older, in a world that worshipped youth but offered no mercy. They were not weak, they were not vain. They were survivors of a silent war, a war against nature, against themselves, against the demands of a world that wanted them beautiful, obedient, eternal, but never real. And yet they left behind more than sorrow. They left behind gestures. A hand on the back to say, I know. A shared glance across the dressing room mirror. A hidden pouch of dried herbs sewn into a sleeve. A letter folded beneath a pillow with words that dared to name pain. They left behind resistance. Not in rebellion, but in tenderness. And now, in this stillness, you carry that inheritance too, not as a burden, but as a remembering. The body you live in, with its scars, its softness, its fierce, quiet strength, is part of that lineage. And as you lie here now, safe beneath your blankets, your eyes growing heavier with each breath, you are unbinding centuries of silence. You are letting the powder fall away, the corsets loosen, the painted smile fade. You are becoming again what they never had time to be. Whole, rested, real. Let the night take you. Let the palace dissolve. Let the ghosts of royal women finally rest in the knowledge that someone remembers them, not as perfect, but as human. Sleep now. You've done enough. They did too.